Hey everybody, this is our presentation on Songbirds use spectral shape, not pitch, for sound pattern recognition. My name is Will, Sean's here, and Olivia will be joining us in a little bit. So some important terms to go over really quickly. Absolute pitch, we all know quite a bit about. We've talked a bit about it in class at length. Comparative cognition is when you're comparing how two or more species process or interact with stimuli like pitch, so how we process pitch versus how a European starling processes pitch. Pitch processing is the perception and breakdown of pitch as it relates to sensory systems, auditory systems, brain functioning, and so on. And pattern perception involves two things. One, a stimuli, and two, information received from memory. So let's say I played you some tones 50 times over 5 minutes, and then I played you that same tone 10 minutes later. You would be hearing it in real time and processing it, and you'd also be accessing your memory from hearing it beforehand.
All right, lastly, spectral shape is a pretty important term to understand before we delve into this study. And the researchers in this study define spectral shape as the overall pattern of amplitudes across frequency bands. So overall, spectral shape includes components of frequency and amplitudes of the waves within a particular sound, and it plays a crucial role in determining the pitch and timbre of that sound. One important thing to distinguish in this experiment is the difference between sounds with a stable temporal shape, such as pure tones and the sounds of individual musical instruments with a given timbre, versus more natural sounds that are composed of complex spectral shapes. So such sounds would include starling bird song, human speech, and music that contains a wide variety of instruments instead of just one.
So the author's main question for this study was, what are the qualifiers that affect tone sequence perception and recognition for European starling songbirds? And so would it be absolute pitch? Would it be timbre? Would it be spectral shape? So we're trying to find out, and these are the authors of the paper down here.
All right, so birds have been shown to recognize tone sequences when confined to a trained range of frequencies. And this previous data was used to conclude that absolute pitch and thus the actual frequency height of tones is what the birds were remembering and recognizing. It's also important to note that this rule doesn't necessarily extend to recognizing birdsong of the same species. It appears that birds are able to recognize their own birdsong when the frequencies are shifted by quite large amounts, and this kind of contradicts the previous literature. Past research that has determined the crucial importance of absolute pitch, or rather assumed the crucial importance of absolute pitch, relies primarily on the use of pure tones with only one frequency, or tones with stable spectral shapes. For example, previous studies have relied, say, on one instrument, such as a piano, which we know to have a certain specific timbre and a relatively stable spectral shape. Ultimately, there's been a severe lack of studies that analyze the effects of multiple instruments or of more natural sounds with varying spectral shape on tone recognition in birds, and thus the component of spectral shape has been largely neglected in previous research.
So moving on to the methods section. The subjects for this study were 5 wild-caught adult European starlings of unknown sex. There were 4 groups of stimuli. The first were training stimuli. These were 6 sequences of 4 tones that were distinct in pitch and timbre. Using a synthesizer, researchers were able to make it so that each pitch had a different instrument to create a unique timbre. So they used an oboe, a vocal ah, a muted trumpet, and a synthesizer. These tones were normalized to a mean power of 65 decibels. The second group were pitch-shifted stimuli. These were the same tones, but shifted up or down a number of steps, with the same interval spacing in timbre. The third were piano tone stimuli. These were novel timbre versions of training stimuli, but with only piano tones. There were 3 ascending and 3 descending sets. These tones were also shifted later in the experiment. And finally, stimuli were put through a noise vocoder to disrupt pitch cues while retaining the spectral shape. Here are some examples to give you an idea of what that sounded like. First, we will see noise vocoding in a way that many of you are probably familiar with, since it's how it's used in pop music.
What did you say? What'd you say? Oh, that you only meant well. Of course you didn't.
Now, unfortunately, the researchers did not play Jason Derulo's What You Say to the starlings. They heard this. So, how did this work? There are 4 phases of training and testing. The first phase was shaping. Subjects were trained to obtain food from a hopper underneath the food port by pecking the center. They were then trained to peck the center and then either the left or right for a reward. And you can see that set up on the slide. The second phase was recognition training. They were trained to associate ascending stimuli with the characteristic timbre sequence, the oboe, ah, muted trumpet, and synthesizer, with the left port, and descending stimuli with the right port. The starlings would peck the center to start the sequence. This peck triggered a speaker that started a playback of a selected stimulus. Pecks to the left or right within 2 seconds led to reinforcement if the starling picked the right port. The correct port, not the right port. Correct responses led to 2 seconds of food access and visual reinforcement with LEDs. Incorrect responses led to 10 to 20 seconds of lights out. The fixed ratio was set at 6 trials per subject. The third phase was recognition testing, which was a probe procedure. The researchers presented training stimuli 66% of the time. The other 33% of the time, researchers presented one of the pitch-shifted or novel timbre stimuli, so the piano or the vocoded pitches. To ensure responses, the researchers required subjects to respond correctly to 6 consecutive training stimuli first. These 6 responses were required to receive a food reward. And finally, on all trials, the starlings went through a transfer procedure. So in all trials, the starlings switched immediately from training stimuli to sessions where test stimuli were tested. The transfer procedure differentially reinforces responses and thus affords subjects an opportunity to learn stimulus-response associations and providing access to a more subtle behavioral measure and acquisition rate, which is why the researchers opted to include this procedure as well. If the starlings performed an above chance, this indicated, or had an above chance performance, this indicated the generalization or transfer of learning from the training to the test stimuli. If they were below chance, it signified in weaker generalization or transfer of learning from the training to the test stimuli. The starlings were reinforced or punished in the same way as during the recognition training, so either with food and LEDs or lights out. It is important to note that before transferring, the researchers ensured stable, accurate recognition from the starlings before moving to a different stimuli.
All right, so the first part of the results section, what the researchers did was they established a baseline, essentially, so they used training sequences. In order to establish this baseline regarding the bird's pitch perception and sequence, researchers played a series of 4 tones that either went up or went down. Starlings were able to discriminate between the ascending and descending sequences. I will play you that here. So you can hear it's going up. The pitches are varying, but you can hear that each tone has a different timbre. So it's either an oboe, a vocal, a trumpet, or a synth for the first, second, third, and fourth tone. And over 200 trials, the starlings got pretty good at recognizing sequences that were either going up or going down. You can see that in the graph over here. So here's another little showing how the oboe goes from the oboe to the vocals to the trumpet to the synth. Then what the researchers did was they focused on novel pitch levels. And so instead of using the same pitches as before, they changed them. They wanted to see if absolute pitch was at play here. So they introduced novel stimuli. These sequences kept the same relative pitch and timbral pattern from the baseline sequences, but differed in absolute pitch, either by a very small number of semitones or 1 semitone or by a much wider margin. What's important to note here is that once pitch was shifted, even by a very small amount, recognition dropped dramatically in the starlings. So they went from around 93.7% correct in the training baseline tones sequences to around 50% correct with the novel pitch levels. That's roughly chance levels. It's not that great, so it dropped a lot. So starlings do not recognize frequency shifted versions of spectrotemporally complex tones, and this might, based on what we've heard so far, lead to a conclusion that birds operate primarily using absolute pitch cues when processing sound. That's kind of the preconceived notion, but going forward, we might prove that wrong. And I'll play you a tone here. So it's preserving the timbre, but the pitches are shifted a little bit. So then they introduced novel timbre. And so is absolute pitch really the primary cue for tone sequence recognition in starlings? The answer is no. Researchers presented sequences that pitch matched the baseline training sequences, but differed in regards to spectral shape. So instead of using an oboe, a synth, a voice, now we're just using piano tones. So the spectral shape is going to be different here. With a novel timbre, the starlings recognize sequences at chance values yet again, so roughly 45 to 60% correct. The absolute pitch of the baseline training sequences, so the actual pitch that they used in the first part of the study, was the same, just the timbre is different here. The preconceived notion that starlings use absolute pitch in order to recognize tone sequences is challenged by these results. And here is an audio. You can hear it's just a piano, no switching back and forth now. Here's a graphic of that. And the last thing, and possibly the most important of the study, was when the researchers passed these tone sequences through a vocoder. So for previous trials, researchers manipulated either the pitch height or the timbre of the tone sequences. And with both of these trials, the starlings were less likely to correctly recognize sequences that were going up or going down pretty much at chance values in regards to accuracy. For this trial, researchers directly pitted spectral shape information against absolute pitch information. And they did this by passing the audio files through a noise vocoder. And as we talked about earlier, and Sean will talk about in a little bit, that's stripping a lot of the important pitch information from these tone sequences. So did the starlings better recognize the tone sequences when the absolute spectral shape or envelope was the dominant cue and the pitch was kind of stripped? The answer is yes. They actually performed very well for this part of the study. Here's what these tone sequences sounded like. If you can hear that, it pretty much sounds like random noise. But for the European starling, they were able to pretty accurately distinguish whether these sequences were going up or down, even though you really can't detect pitch in those, but the spectral envelope is preserved, and that's what's important here.
All right, so to reiterate, starlings recognize a sequence of tones composed of various pitches and timbres through auditory processing, primarily of spectral shape of the sounds and not the absolute pitch. However, it is still believed that pitch is perceived by starlings, since they have been shown to actually recognize the pitch of the missing fundamental and complex tones. Ultimately, this is to say that starlings might recognize pitch similarly to humans, but they do not rely on it to understand patterns of sound. The starlings' reliance on spectral shape to recognize sequences of sounds is similar to how humans recognize the more complex spectral shapes that occur during human speech and how we derive meaning from it, but it differs from how humans recognize music in terms of using relative pitch patterns. In birds, pitch and timbre is likely not interpreted as distinct entities, but rather they compose the greater concept of spectral envelope. However, starlings rely on absolute and not relative spectral envelope. So basically this means starlings are unable to detect frequency shifted versions of tonal sequences despite preserved spectral relationships, so that would be relative spectral envelope, and that they rely more on the exact shape of the amplitudes and frequencies that they're exposed to in the original tone sequences, so that would be the absolute spectral envelope. And that's how they recognize the tone sequences. So some critiques from the study, or of the study. The study relies on the use of musical instruments and human vocals, which starlings have been shown to process differently than their own birdsong. For example, we know that starlings can actually recognize their birdsong despite these large shifts in frequency, but this was the opposite when when the researchers used tone patterns with differing musical instruments. The researchers also failed to explain the difference in performance of the pre and post vocoding tone recognition. While it's evident that the birds are much better than humans at recognizing tone sequences and when the elements of pitch are stripped of the vocoder, they still seem to do a little bit worse than when pitch is preserved, and therefore it is not entirely accurate to completely negate the fact that there is a possible influence of absolute pitch, despite the fact that we know now that it's not the primary way that they recognize tone patterns. Lastly, the researchers do not give a great or really in-depth explanation of what they mean by spectral shape, and a lot of the interpretation of the results needed to come from analyzing the actual graphs and from previous knowledge from the course.
So some remaining questions for the class in the discussion. The first one, how would the results be different if the birds listened to the tonal patterns from their same species instead of from musical instruments like the oboe or synth? Would they rely more on relative or absolute temporal shape? And would they be more or less accurate at detecting frequency shifts?
And lastly, more of an evolutionary question, but what benefit would it serve for birds to have an auditory system based primarily on the absolute spectral envelope? Why not, say, the relative spectral envelope, or why not relative pitch?